So we are continuing on in our series on Esther, Esther and the Hidden King. Again, this is looking at the story of Esther, looking at a book, at an Old Testament book that is not one that readily has God jumping out of the pages. A lot of stories in the Old Testament usually have God just jumping out. You can't hide from him. You can't run away from him. He's there. You can't escape it. And yet when we look at the story of Esther, what we see is a God that seems in many ways absent, a God that just simply isn't there, or so it appears, so it seems, so it feels so often. And I like to point that out, especially when I talk about the story of Esther, because really that's in many ways, that's what life is like, right? I mean, my guess is most of us, we don't go around talking or thinking about our life and looking at our life and seeing God around every single corner. More often than not, God is kind of somewhere else out there, somewhere we don't see him. We don't hear him talking to us. We don't see him doing these incredible miracles, at least nothing that we would ordinarily attribute to being these incredible miracles. And yet God is always there, just like he is in the story of Esther. We left off last week with a fast, with Esther declaring a fast. And I actually said and mentioned when we talked about that and looked at that at the end of chapter 4, those last few verses, that last call that Esther gave to the Jewish community to fast for 3 days and 3 nights had more to do, it had a greater impact on where we're going today than what it did in our text last week. And we looked at that, and the significance of this 3-day fast. And I mentioned that this ancient Jewish commentary called a midrash, it was written really centuries after Esther, but looking back on the story of Esther and on the significance of this number 3 and how often the number 3 keeps coming up in the Old Testament. And this ancient Jewish commentary on Esther made the commenter pointed out that God will never allow his people to be in dire distress for more than 3 days. And that in and of itself is really an incredibly insightful and incredibly impactful idea that God's people, that Israel, that these ancient Jews, that they were able to look at God, to look at their experience, to look at their story and say, you know what? God never abandons us. We might go through periods where things just seem like God has abandoned us, where it seems like God's not there, but he will never really abandon us. He will never allow us to be in dire distress for more than 3 days. And there's another verse, a passage out of the prophet of Hosea, that kind of plays into something also when ancient Jews would think about this 3-day thing, out of Hosea chapter 6 that I'll read here real quick before we get going too far. Hosea 6 chapter 2 says, after 2 days he will revive us, and on the 3rd day he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. And so in addition to this idea that God will not abandon his people or leave us in distress for more than 3 days, there's also this idea that resurrection takes place after 3 days. Resurrection takes place after 3 days. It's the way that these ancient Jews would understand that verse, that passage out of Hosea. And so if you ever kind of wonder why exactly was Jesus raised after 3 days, what was the point? Why 3 days, not 1 day? Why not 3 hours? Why not 3 weeks? Why did it have to be 3 days? Hosea has an answer for you as to why those sorts of things happen the way they do. I point this out is because when ancient Jews would read the story of Esther and look to the story of Esther, what they see is a story of death and resurrection as we transition from chapter 4 to chapter 5. A story of death and resurrection where God's people are, as far as they're concerned, they're as good as dead. And yet, now we have and move into this promise of resurrection in chapter 5. Let me pray a second, and then we'll take a look at our text. Heavenly Father, Lord, pray that you open our ears, open our hearts, open our minds, that we may hear you, that we may understand, that we may see, that we may be changed and transformed by your word this morning, by the words of Esther, by this message of resurrection and satisfaction. In Jesus' name, amen. So Esther chapter 5 this morning, we're going to break it up into 2 parts, kind of making the dividing line verse 8. So I'll go ahead and read those first 8 verses now. We'll make a few comments and then we'll keep moving through it. So Esther chapter 5, beginning at verse 1. So on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner circle of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom I will give you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared, and as they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." And Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." So the Israelites living in Persia, living kind of spread out throughout the country, especially those Israelites in Susa, they're mourning. They've put on sackcloth, just like Mordecai. They've covered themselves in ashes. They're going around wailing. They're mourning, and they're acting as though they have actually already died. They still have 11 months yet before this edict from the last chapter is handed down, before they're finally facing this slaughter that has been promised to them. But they're already acting like that future promise, or that future thing that they're looking forward to has already become a present day reality. And so they're going around and they're mourning, and Esther asks them to fast for 3 days as she prepares and tries to work out what she's going to do. Now, that question about what she's going to do, I've alluded to this a few times, that Esther is in many ways, she's working through this identity crisis that she's now been faced with. Is she a Jewish girl named Hadassah from the Jewish quarter of Susa, or is she really a Persian queen? Has she completely assimilated into Persian culture and taken on that identity, or is she still going to hold true and still going to stick to her commitment to her family, to Mordecai as a Jew? Which is it going to be? What is she going to do? And that's what she works out throughout those 3 days of fasting. And now we have here in chapter 5, it seems like she's worked that out. She's faced with this choice of, do I make my Jewishness known and then fall under the same threat of this edict? Or do I hide it and cover up and hide in the safety of the palace while my family is killed? And we see now in chapter 5, she decides she's Jewish. But it's Jewish with a twist, because we see right at the very beginning, right in verse 1 already, yes, she's going to Xerxes. Yes, she plans on revealing herself, but she goes dressed in her royal robes. Her royal robes. And these are not her lounging around the palace everyday robes that these aren't her sweats and her sweatshirt or whatever it may be. That's not what she's putting on. She's putting on her royal robes. These are the robes that she would only pull out for special occasions. So you can imagine she puts on this robe. It's probably made out of purple. Another really, again, here's this purple thing again, like we saw in the first chapter. It's expensive. It shows her royalty. She puts on purple. She puts on her best jewelry. She puts on her makeup and her cosmetics and does all this stuff that they were planning on doing. She's probably even putting on and wearing her crown. And this isn't for a state dinner. This isn't for some special occasion. This is midday Wednesday. There's nothing going on. So she puts on her royal robes and she goes and she just starts milling about in the court just outside of the throne room. She doesn't approach. She just mills about. She just hangs out right where Xerxes can see her, hoping for something, hoping for a positive response from Xerxes. And as she's doing that, and as she's drawing attention to herself, and as she's sticking out because, she's all dressed up. Why is she dressed up on a Wednesday, on Midday Wednesday? There's nothing going on. Xerxes does exactly what she doesn't think will happen. He raises his scepter. He points at her, signaling that she has his permission to come in and approach. And one of the biggest reasons as to why a queen like Esther would put on her royal robes, especially at a state function, at a big, hootenanny. I don't even know if that's a word. That's a funny word. As some sort of big deal, some sort of big event, is because you want to wear these royal robes so that everybody knows who the queen is. You think about all these government officials coming and they're all dressed in their best because they're going to meet the king, and everybody wants to be dressed in their best to make the best impression. But the king and the queen have to stand out. And so by putting on her royal robes, she is drawing attention to the fact that she is not just somebody who lives in the palace. She is the queen. She is the queen of Persia. And so Xerxes extends his scepter, invites her in, she goes in, and everything she does is about putting herself in a position of humility and submission. Now, this is different. See, Xerxes isn't used to this. Xerxes isn't used to a queen who actually submits to him and humbles himself before him. Xerxes is used to a queen like Vashti who does these power plays and tries to duke it out publicly for power and control of the kingdom. And yet here comes Esther, emphasizing her royal position. She kneels down and she touches his scepter, which shows that she is willing to submit and be humble before him. And she's again speaking to Xerxes in a way that shows that she is putting herself in this lowly position, asking for his favor. So she does this, probably catches Xerxes off guard a little bit, and Xerxes says, Queen Esther, what do you want? What is your request? Whatever you want, up to half the kingdom. Now, no way Xerxes is actually going to give half his kingdom to Esther. He's been through that before. He doesn't want a power struggle on his hands. So he's not going to do that. It's a figure of speech, which really just means that Esther, come to me. What is your request? I'm feeling generous today. Ask me for something. Whatever you're going to ask me for, I'm going to give it to you, within reason, of course. But whatever you want, it's all yours. What do you want? And so Esther says, not, I'm a Jew, and you got to do something about this edict. Not that Haman is a bad guy who has issued this edict in your name, who has deceived you to commit murder, to commit genocide on my people. Because Haman is Xerxes' best friend. She can't go in and just all of a sudden start attacking Haman, because Xerxes is immediately going to become defensive about that. This is his best friend. She has to walk lightly. Come to a banquet. Come eat food. Because everybody knows food, and everybody knows the stomach is the way to a man's heart. Come eat food. Come drink wine. I got this big spread going for you. Come and do this. Oh, and by the way, this is only for you and Haman, because I just think you guys are the greatest in the world ever. Come and have fun and celebrate and gorge just because you are who you are. So, of course, who's going to say no to that? So Xerxes calls for Haman. They go to the banquet, and they're at the banquet. And Xerxes knows how this works. He knows what it looks like when somebody's trying to butter him up. He knows what it looks like when somebody's trying to, kiss up to him or stoke his ego. And so they're at the banquet, and they're getting full on wine and food and whatever else it is that Esther gave him. And he says, all right, Esther, we're full. What do you want? What are you doing all this for? What is your request? Half the kingdom again. What's your request? And Esther doesn't come out and tell him she's a Jew. She doesn't come out and tell him all this stuff. Yet she doesn't go after Haman. She says, come back tomorrow. I'm going to give you another banquet. I want you, if I've still found favor, and if you still like me, then come back tomorrow for another banquet. Just you and Haman. Because you guys rock. You're the coolest cats in this kingdom. You're my favorite people ever. So just for the two of you, it's an exclusive club just for the two of you. Come back tomorrow. Let me get to verse 9. Verse 9. Haman went out that day, happy and in high spirits, but when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. So day one of the banquet's over. Haman's feeling pretty good about himself. He takes off. He's on his way out of the palace. He's heading home, probably for another dinner, because that's just kind of what he does, I guess. He's going through the king's gate, that main entrance and exit to the king, to Xerxes' palace. He's walking through the gate, and there's Mordecai sitting there doing his thing. He's not mourning anymore. He doesn't have the sackcloth on him anymore. He's not covered in ashes anymore. He's just sitting at the gate doing his thing, doing what he always does, not showing any sign of being aware of what's going on around him. And here comes Haman, and Mordecai doesn't even flinch. Haman's feeling good about himself, but the one man that he is most irritated by, most annoyed by, doesn't even begin to react or show any response that he is in any way, shape, or form afraid of Haman or the power that he wields. He just sits there. And Haman, and all of his ego stoking that has taken place today, all of a sudden it's gone. It's out the window. So what does he do? He goes home. Haman goes home. He decides it's time, okay, you know what? Mordecai's not going to do this. I got to do something. I'm going to go home and brag. So he goes home and he calls all of his friends together. And Haman's a pretty important guy, so he's going to have lots of friends because that's what important guys have. So he's going to call all of his friends together and his wife and his family. He's going to call them together and he's going to brag. He's going to talk about all this stuff that he has. He's going to boast. He flat out boasts to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king has honored him. So now why his vast wealth? Well, because only important people are wealthy. You don't get wealthy, you don't work hard. This wasn't during a time where if you work hard enough and you go to school and you get all the right connections and everything else, that you're going to get a good job and then you're going to make lots of money and retire in a nice, comfy position in life. That's not how it worked. The only people who were rich were people who were important, people who the government officials, but ideally the king, thought highly of, so he would just shower you with money and wealth or put you in a position where you could take advantage of the poor. And so the fact that Haman had vast wealth, shows that he was important. He wants to make sure that all of his neighbors and friends and family see this. His many friends, his many sons, I mean. Why his many sons? Why is that such a big deal? In chapter 9, we're going to find out that Haman has 10 sons in chapter 9. That's a lot of sons. That's a lot of food. I can't even imagine. I mean, we got 2 kids. I can't even imagine what the grocery bill is going to be like when they get to high school. But 10 sons. And the whole idea behind that was that back in this day, in this culture, the more sons you had spoke to your strength, especially as a man. If you have a lot of sons, then you must be really strong and really masculine. The more sons you have, the better a man you are. And so Haman is now bragging, not just about his vast wealth and his importance in society. He's now bragging about the fact that, look at me, I'm a man's man. I am a macho man. I don't know what it is. But he wants to brag. He wants to make sure that everybody knows just how strong and masculine he is. So he brags about his sons and how many sons he has. And he brags about all the ways that the king honored him. Well, the king's got to think you're a pretty swell guy if he's honoring you, especially if he's making you second in command in the kingdom. So he's bragging about all of this stuff. Then he gets to verse 12. And that's not all. I'm going to see if I can do this right. And that's not all, Haman said. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. Neener, neener, neener. I mean, that's kind of the way it is, right? That's kind of what it sounds like. Look at me. Ha, ha, ha. You don't get to go. Neener, neener, neener. So he just kind of keeps the bragging going. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. You got to read this with the best spoiled rich girl kind of voice. Because that's kind of the way he's talking about this. I got all this stuff going for me, everything that anybody in this kingdom could want, but none of it gets me any satisfaction. I can't get no satisfaction. Okay. For all you Stones fans out there, and no, I did not have to Google that. I knew who sung that. So I always think of that whenever I read this passage. Bunny trail. Where am I? This is what happens. All right, so Haman's bragging, and he says, I get no satisfaction out of this. All this stuff, I get no satisfaction out of this. What am I going to do about this? We're going to come back to that word satisfaction in a minute. And his wife and his friends say, this is what you do. Build a pole. A gallows in some of our older translations. Build a pole, a gallows 75 feet tall, which is way higher than it needs to be, and impale Mordecai on it? Why wait 11 months until he's going to be wiped out? Take care of him now. The idea is that because his poll is so high, because it's way higher than it needs to be, the idea is that they want to shame Mordecai, they want to shame his family, and to the extent that Haman's ego has been damaged, that's how high the poll is. So the higher the poll, the more your ego has been hurt there. And that's kind of the idea there. So that's how far we're going to go here. Let's go back to verse 13 again, and that idea is satisfaction in a second. Haman doesn't have any satisfaction. He can't get any satisfaction whenever he looks at Mordecai. The Hebrew word here for satisfaction, it's a little bit of a unique word that has a unique kind of nuance or meaning to it, and it's the word shana. And it's related to, it's kind of in the same grouping, the same word family as the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace or completeness or wholeness, which is kind of an important word theologically in terms of the Bible. You know, this whole idea of God's peace, God's shalom, and that God is making shalom and making peace in the world. It's sort of connected to this whole idea of making everything new when we get to the end times or the end of time. When Jesus returns. It's also connected, and it's seen as a synonym, shana, is seen as a synonym in the Old Testament to the Hebrew word shavah, which means deliverance, salvation, to rescue, to give relief. And I point that out is because when these ancient Hebrew readers would read this story, or when a Hebrew speaker reads this story, what they see in this word and what they see in Haman's complaint is a reference or a desire to try to strive after a satisfaction that goes beyond simply taking pride in a job well done. What Haman is striving after in all these things is a deeper satisfaction, a satisfaction that fills a longing, a hole, a gap in his life. He's looking for meaning. He's looking for purpose. He's looking for a reason to live and to do what he does. That is what he's looking for, and he's doing it. He's doing it through his career. He's doing it through his family. He's doing it through his social status. He's doing it through his Facebook friends list. He's doing it in things that are only going to leave him empty. And for some reason or other, he blames it all on Mordecai. We got to be careful not to get too hard on Haman, though, here a second. We got to be really careful not to get too hard on him, because the reality is that we do the same thing, right? I mean, we do the same thing. I mean, we go around through life. We go into all these different areas, these different aspects of life, and we get into these things, and we're looking to fill these own voids, these gaps in our own life. We're looking for ways to answer this question of meaning, a purpose of why do we exist? What are we here for? What are we doing? We're looking for ways to fill these spots and these questions in our mind, and we do it through a whole bunch of stuff that's ultimately going to leave us empty. What we need is a more supernatural and a lasting satisfaction. See, Esther was seeking satisfaction too. In that first half of the chapter, she was seeking a certain type of satisfaction that is different from the type of satisfaction that Haman is seeking in the last half of chapter 5. Esther was looking for a satisfaction that goes beyond simply the riches and everything else. She's looking for a satisfaction that ultimately fills the only void that she knows she has, and that's this void to deal with the threat of death, this void to deal with the threat of non-existence. And so she goes, and she's going, even though she's going before Xerxes, she's going with confidence and with faith that God is going to do something for his people, for somebody else. And she's looking to have that need and that longing satisfied. That's really what chapter 5 is really in many ways getting at. It's getting at this desire and this longing and this need and this search for satisfaction, for ultimate satisfaction. The good news in all that is that Jesus is a better satisfaction. That sounded bad. Jesus is a better satisfaction. Yeah. And sometimes we might be familiar with that word satisfaction in reference to Jesus. in sort of an old theological way, in a certain way, and it might be a little bit different from the way that Haman or that Esther maybe are looking for satisfaction, but we can become familiar with that idea that Jesus is a better satisfaction, and we look at a story like Esther 5, and we see Jesus stepping in, not necessarily in a visible way or an obvious way, but he is again that hidden king sitting in the background as that better satisfaction. We realize that we messed that up. I think about a number of years ago in my own life, a long time ago, before I even went to seminary, I remember making a comment to somebody, and this was just kind of a dumb thing for me to do, making a comment to somebody that the biggest reason I wanted to become a senior pastor was because that would mean I would be the boss of a church, or so I thought. Luckily, I got set straight. A good friend of mine, a good pastor friend of mine, set me straight and kind of knocked some sense into me. But we do that. We look for, at one point, I looked for and I thought that getting this career success was going to meet that need of satisfaction, was going to satisfy that need, that longing that I had for meaning and for purpose and for importance. And Haman did too. Every now and then, admittedly, I daydream about what it would be like to win the lottery. Anybody else think about that? Anybody else dream about that? All of a sudden you wake up one morning and you're $50 million richer, and it's like, hey, this is great. Pay off my car loan, I can pay off my mortgage, I can get out of debt, I can take any vacation I want, I can buy a jet, I can keep Joel Faber in business. We can do all sorts of things. You guys just totally missed that one. Joel's laughing. Thanks, Joel. Take it from the smartest finance guy here. But you dream about that stuff, you daydream about that stuff, and you start thinking, if only I had more money, then my life would be fulfilled, then I would have meaning, then I would have satisfaction. Haman thought that. Do you? Parenting. I'm not a mom, obviously, but I've heard, oftentimes something that can happen. Sorry if this is stereotypical. It's just stories that I hear sometimes. Sometimes when it comes to moms, maybe you desire, or a woman desires and longs to be a mom, and when that finally becomes a reality, when they finally become a mom, they think their life is complete. And then they start looking at the diapers, and they start looking at the whining and the crying and the being up all night long and the laundry. Oh, my word, the laundry. Right? The laundry. And after a while, you start realizing, you know what? Kids are pretty swell and all, but this is not what I imagined. Sometimes we look for meaning in our kids, in our families. We look to be satisfied in that area. And we oftentimes find ourselves left wanting at least a little bit. And pick on, Facebook. There was a time where, when Facebook first came around, we started to compete and compare ourselves to our Facebook friends to see who could get the most friends. And then that kind of got old, and we started realizing nobody really has 1,500 friends. We look for satisfaction in our friends, in our relationships, because we want to be known and we want to be important. We figure the more people we know and have connections to, even if we've never met them before in our life, we must be important, and that must satisfy us. But it doesn't really, does it? Men and women, because this is an issue with both. Oftentimes, many men and women will look for satisfaction in pornography. I know, it's one of those topics we don't talk about in church. And yet what we find is that it leaves us wanting. It leaves the real thing pretty unsatisfying in many ways. Always. We look for satisfaction in all these things that the world says this is going to satisfy you, in our careers, in our family, in our friends, in our sexual lives, in our parenting, whatever it may be, in our financial status. We look for satisfaction in these things, but all we really ultimately find is we find ourselves just singing along with the Rolling Stones. We don't find it. We don't get it. But Jesus does it better. Jesus does it better. He is a better satisfaction to our longings and our pursuit and our search for purpose and meaning and really importance even in life. You can see what so often happens is we come here on Sunday mornings and we bring Jesus into our life once a week for about 2 hours when we're here in church, and we end up leaving him and checking him at the door until we need him next Sunday, when what we really need to be doing is taking him out into the world with us, taking him into our cubicles, into our laundry room, into our relationships, our friendships, to the garbage can with us. We need to be taking him out into our lives with us, so that because only he is going to really bring satisfaction, that longing for need and desire, that filling that gap, that hole in our life that we are so desperately searching for. Because only Jesus is really a satisfaction. Jesus is a better satisfaction than anything we're going to find in the world. Esther went to Xerxes. When she went to Xerxes, she knew that God was with her. She went because she had faith and confidence that God was going to work that out, that he was going to be there. He was going to guide that conversation and whatever was going to come out of it. She might have died. She was afraid of that. But she knew that no matter what, God was still there. She still had that satisfaction. And yet so often we're so quick to kind of compartmentalize our life. God and Jesus over here, life over here. And we rarely bring those two worlds together, and what we end up doing is finding ourselves very unsatisfied. We have got to keep Jesus in our life. Last night, as I was sitting with David and Heidi Hanna at 2 o'clock in the morning, yes, I've been up that late, that long. See, I'm getting all mixed up because of it. I was struck by the fact that no matter what was going to happen, as they were wrestling and really honestly questioned and wondered, are they going to be bringing Grace, and are they even going to bring her home? They were still able to sit there and say, we know that God is here at this moment right now. They have found their satisfaction. Have you found your satisfaction in Jesus for the sake of the gospel? See, there's nothing wrong with desiring a successful career or a healthy child or even financial blessing. Those things in and of themselves are not wrong, but if we think those things are going to satisfy us by themselves, we're going to find ourselves even more empty than we were when we started. And in finding ourselves empty, we're going to miss the fact, we're going to miss the fact that we have been called, or he has called each of us to be messengers of our own 3 days. The only 3 days really that ultimately matter. Those 3 days that Jesus spent in the grave, after which he rose again, victorious. It's because that truth, that is the only thing that really satisfies.